PowerPoint mode.
And I keep forgetting I have to shut it down.
What do you got to shut down? To PowerPoint mode.
My YouTube page. I have to shut it down. All right, Eric, I think we're online. How are you going?
Good. I could hear a bit of an echo there. That's what we're talking about shutting down, I guess.
Yeah. Eric, an exciting week this week. We finally get to go to Jerusalem.
Yeah, I think out of all of Israel, it's probably I think we spent about 4 or 5 days there, didn't we? We spent
close to half our trip. There's so much to see in Jerusalem.
Yeah, it was sensational. Yeah, I think that's probably the highlight of the place of the Israel trip was Jerusalem. Yeah, we got there. That was awesome. Didn't take it before today, but yeah.
Before we get to Jerusalem, we're actually going to go to Bethlehem, which is a bit counterintuitive because we've been doing this tour kind of chronologically, but we're going back to the start. And the reason we're doing that is because you can see on this map, Bethlehem is actually right next to Jerusalem. So Jesus lives in Nazareth, but his mum is potentially from Sepphoris, actually. That's according to tradition. And then just above Sepphoris is Cana. So remember, Mary also has relatives at Cana because that's where Jesus in John chapter 2 performs the miracle. But there's a census and you have to go back. And so Joseph and Mary head down to Bethlehem and they would have relatives there, obviously, and probably the baby is born in a relative's house amongst the animals. And that word can translate in. Now, Eric, that's modern day Bethlehem, right?
Yeah, when we went there, it was quite hilly, and I guess from a tourist perspective, they were saying there's not a lot to really see here. I think there's a church where they think the site of where Jesus may have been born, so they've obviously built another church there to mark the place.
We'll come to that, but I think looking at this picture, this is not as picturesque or as wealthy, and when you're in the streets, there's dirt, there's no rubbish collection. And that's because we're actually in Palestinian territory. So what was your reflections on kind of the difference between Palestinian territories and Israel, where Jews live?
Well, I think it's, like you said, David, there's the rubbish. It sounds like they don't have the standard services. So rubbish piles up. I think the Palestinians work in a regional type area. So something that may clean up stuff, people won't. So there's high grass, it's unkept, it's not very nice. Definitely a different feel to the Israel side of Israel.
Yeah. You actually feel potentially unsafe.
Yeah.
In normal Israel, it's affluent, it's first world standard. Food, for instance, is as expensive, if not more expensive than Australia. But Palestinian territory, it feels like you're moving back towards kind of developing world standards. And it really strikes you the kind of inherent racism that the Israeli government has for those who kind of live in the occupied territories. Anyway, Bethlehem is one of those. Have we got a photo of the church?
Yeah, so this shot here.
So this is where, and we haven't talked about this yet, but this is where you bump into the fact that Christians have been going back to a place for generations. Emperor Hadrian, in about 160 AD, is trying to squash all places of Christian worship. And actually, he ends up building an alternate worship site at what was believed to be the site of Jesus' birth. And that's where Constantine's mum goes and says, oh, now I know where this site is because Hadrian built a religious temple there. And so it's long been a sacred site for pagans and now Christians. And since about the 4th century, there have been churches there and people have been going and pilgrimages and worshipping and praying and celebrating the birth of Jesus. So, but there was a massive queue. It was like an hour and a quarter or something.
Yeah, I think, and that's like it's the modern day pilgrimage equivalent, I guess, isn't it? As in the tourist trips. And I think that was the thing I really appreciated about our tour actually was that we didn't actually do a lot of those types of church visits. You know, we went to the sites
Yeah.
to understand the significance of the sites, but not necessarily do the pilgrimage piece where we had to go and touch something or whatever, you know.
Yeah. So the Orthodox and the Catholics have that type of a pilgrimage.
Yeah.
You know, they're bringing kind of grandma's scarf because she's sick and they're rubbing it on the tomb and this type of stuff. But that isn't what the Protestants tend to do. And then actually, from memory, I think there was another cave around the back that we snuck in and tried to visit as well. But anyway, so Bethlehem counterintuitively wasn't a highlight of the trip. And you might think it would be, but that's the site where church history tells us that Jesus was born. All right, next.
So now we go to Jericho, and just picking up on that thread about the Palestinian area. I remember on the road to Jericho, we went past the camp. I don't know if you remember this, David.
Yeah.
We had the razor wire and all this sort of stuff. So they have like these security posts and gates that they can shut at a moment's notice. So it's sort of that sense of, you know, it's different, you know, different standards, different lifestyles for the Palestinians versus the Israelis.
Yeah, and we had a Palestinian tour guide, but if you have a Jewish tour guide, they hop off the bus and they let you go into Jericho without them because they just believe they're not safe. So, you know, Jericho, of course, is not only a New Testament city, it's an Old Testament city. So let's kind of begin there. Joshua takes Jericho in a battle. Jericho is actually believed to be the oldest city anywhere in the world. And we have evidence of civilization kind of beginning there from about 8,000 BC. So that's incredibly old. Have we got a photo of some of the...
Yeah, so this gives you a bit of an aerial shot. Compliments of Google. So it just shows you basically the ruins, I guess, of the old town. Obviously, there's not much left. And they talk about it being a tell. So like we spoke last week, that the tell is where they have multiple layers of building upon building of different periods of architecture and the like.
Yeah.
And as they're doing the archaeology, they're finding different information around that. And as you said, David, they've found a lot of stuff that really dates it well to be one of the oldest cities. So
that's part of the excavations there in the foreground, I think.
Yeah, the pit there. Yeah, that's right.
So you've got a city that's 8,000 years old. What's significant about the city is that it's very warm. It's warm in winter because it's the lowest city anywhere in the world. And we've got that phenomena that we talked about with the Dead Sea, where as you go down, you get hot temperature, just like when you go up, it gets colder. So it's warm. There's a natural spring there that's full of minerals. That means you can grow things. And it's also a good place to cross the Jordan River. There's a natural ford there. And so it was a very politically, economically strategic location. And that's part of what God is saying to the Israelites and Joshua in the Old Testament. I know it would make great sense to kind of keep this city, but actually you'll be cursed if you do. You have to trust in me that I will defend you, not in kind of political and military strongholds in strategic locations. That's contemporary Jericho. In the background there is the Mount of Temptation, and you can see some little buildings just up the top there on the left-hand corner. We might come to those in a minute. All right, there we are. So this is another monastery, and this is believed to be the site where Jesus was tempted by Satan in the desert. And the third temptation is, I'll show you the kingdoms of the world. And so you can see people there, and there's just these natural caves everywhere. We'll come to that in a minute at our next monastery. But there's been church fathers who would go here from the 4th, 5th century onwards. And there were monasteries that were set up. And that was part of how Israel was kind of re-Christianized from the Byzantine era until the Muslims come and conquer it in about 700 AD. Okay, what else have we got?
So that moves us into St. George. So there was a monastery in St. George. So the next one just shows you where it is. And really what this is on the road from Jericho to Jerusalem. And you can sort of see the monastery is marked out here. And obviously you can do some walking or hiking trips. Now people would do that to do that hike from Jericho. So Jericho is the lowest point. So go up to Jerusalem as you walk along the track.
Yeah, that'd be a full day hike along what you call the Wadi Kel. Let me just stay with this map for a minute, Eric.
Yeah.
We, of course, meet Zacchaeus in the New Testament, who lives in New Testament Jericho. And it's the quickest and the safest way. There is a longer, slower, less safe way. Not that this way is completely safe, but it's the quickest, safest way to get to Jerusalem. Therefore, it's the route that most people take. Therefore, it's got a tax collecting booth at the start of the walk. And that's probably why Zacchaeus is such a wealthy tax collector, because he's at one of the prime tax collection points. Because, of course, the Jews have to go to Jerusalem at least once a year, but if they can afford it 3 times a year for religious festivals.
Yeah, I think according to Google, they were actually saying that this was the major arterial, basically, this road. So, and I guess it's a package tax. So every time you walk in, you get taxed based on what goods you're taking.
Yeah, potentially. Yeah. So it's not a cheap thing to go on a spiritual pilgrimage in the New Testament times. All right.
Yeah. So the next shot here just gives you a sense of the wadi, I guess. So you can sort of see that it's basically a dry seabed. You can see some tracks along here. I think sometimes the trail you might walk in the riverbed, or other times you might be walking on the side of the hill.
Yeah.
And then the next shot gives you a bit of a view of St. George Monastery.
Yeah. It's another monastery that was built in the 5th century, I think, by the Orthodox. Have we got a closer up photo of that? So you can see that there are some caves there. So what would happen in the rhythms of the Orthodox desert fathers, they were sometimes called, is that you would we'll begin the week on a Saturday. You would have food together. You'd get your stuff together. You'd chat with people on the Saturday. On the Sunday, you'd have worship. On the Monday, you would go up and sit in your own private cave. And so there would be monks sitting up in the caves for 4 or 5 days by themselves, praying, reading, waiting on God. And then they would come back down at the end of the week and they would have conversations about what did God say to you. So it's just a completely different sort of a spirituality. And that ascetic spirituality, that self-denial, that was esteemed by the Orthodox tradition in the Byzantine era. And so that was a really high calling if you followed that sort of a monastic life. Not in fashion anymore, but it's fascinating. Eric, can you just jump one slide back?
Give me a moment. It's just frozen. There you go.
Great. Part of the reason the Orthodox chose that site is because some people speculate that is the valley of the shadow of death in Psalm 23. And that kind of works, doesn't it? It looks like a forbidden, forsaken, dangerous kind of a place where you feel like the elements are overcoming you and you're exposed.
And it was quite remote, wasn't it? Like for us to get to it,
yeah,
we had to go down quite a winding track, and then we had to walk away to get to this location as well. So it is quite remote.
Yep. Okay.
And the next shot just gives you that with a bit of a sense of the hill and a bit more of the caves. You can sort of see some of the caves in here where they would be spending time. The other one we spoke a bit earlier today was around the cross at the top there as a bit of a marker as well.
Yeah, and there's, I think, a track across the top that some people would walk. And you might also see still today some Bedouin farmers wandering around looking after their goats. So they're in this type of region as well. So this is the Judean desert, right? This is where Jesus spends his 40 days. And we'll talk about this a little bit later, but it's remarkably close to Jerusalem. And you will come past the Mount of Olives before you go down into Jerusalem at the end of this track. Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Eric.
It was just another bit of a close-up as well, but there's not much to see really, just the way they've got the building at the side of the hill, really.
Yeah, amazing building, isn't it? It's just, we didn't know it was coming, and we just kind of went, wow, when we saw it. Yeah.
And the next one is just, harks back to the
Good Samaritan.
The story of the Good Samaritan being on the side of the road, and the bandits, and it just being a dangerous place to travel as well. It's 18 miles, so I guess 18 miles in the heat. So that's what, 26 kilometres. It's a fair walk, isn't it? To be going.
And of course, the parable of the Good Samaritan talks about a man who's going down from Jerusalem to Jericho. And so now you can just picture the very place where he's walking, and kind of how exposed and how dangerous and how robbers could come out of a cave and you wouldn't know, and there'd be no one around to protect you. Yeah.
So that was St. George. And now we actually get into Jerusalem, the old city.
Yeah. So Israel, of course, is an old part of the world, and there were people who lived in Israel, and Jerusalem, before David took the city, was called Salem, and it was a stronghold of the Jebusites. And they built it on a city because it was a safe place. You kind of had to climb up a hill, and therefore you could easily be attacked by bows and arrows and whatnot. And the old part of the city is the part where David lived, and he took that part and then later expanded a little bit. But today it actually has 4 quarters, Eric.
Yeah, that's right. So you can see on this map here, so there's a what they call a Christian quarter, a Muslim quarter, a Jewish quarter, and an Armenian quarter. So it just shows you in this really, in the old wall, so you can sort of see the old city wall, that they have different communities living, and which just harks back, I guess, to the fact that it's over the centuries, really, there's been a lot of fighting and a lot of conquests that have happened. And I think that even the Jews coming back into Jerusalem, that was the post-war, well, it's a 47, I think, David. So relative recent history that they actually got some land rights back. Although
the Jews have been buying land in Israel for all of the 20th century. So a little bit like we in Australia might think, oh, it's terrible, the Chinese are buying up all our farms. The Palestinians were selling land to the Jews before the Second World War and before Israel was declared a nation. And so the history is a little bit more complicated than just, Israel started a war in 67 or whenever it was. Anyway, that's the city. So let's go to the old quarter now.
Yeah, so this just gives you a sense of, I guess, what they would call it the city of David. So the old city of David, you sort of see the sense of the hill. Up the top here is where the temple was built.
So this is the city that, as the Jebusites would have lived in it.
Yep.
And the city that David would have attacked. And I've got this photo here because you see those 2 little gates that kind of poke out down the side?
Yep.
There's a natural spring that runs down, and so you could have some soldiers with bows and arrows on top of those 4 city walls, and you could sneak down and get safe water so that if someone was trying to attack you via a siege, which was a common way to attack people in that era, you still had access to fresh water. So that was kind of the plan of the Jebusites to kind of protect themselves against their enemies. What's immediately in front of us is called the Kidron Valley. And we'll talk about that next week, because that turns up in the triumphal entry. That all kind of happens in the Kidron Valley. All right, so if we jump to the next slide. This is a cross-section of the water that runs through the old part of the city. And we read in the Old Testament that David defeats Jerusalem by actually climbing up the water shaft, and he has a surprise attack on the Jebusites. And so it's probably Warren's shaft that he climbs up. And that's how he kind of defeats a heavily fortified city. And then there's another tunnel called Hezekiah's tunnel. So Hezekiah, of course, is when the Assyrians have conquered the north, and they're going to come down and lay siege to the south. And so Hezekiah figures, I need to expand my city, and I need to also find a way to get to fresh water. And so he digs another tunnel. So there's now going to be 2 tunnels to get to fresh water. And that's another way where the people of Jerusalem can protect themselves from the Assyrians. And if we go forward, Eric, you can still walk in Hezekiah's tunnel today. We did that, didn't we?
We did, and it was, you can see it's quite steep, this part. So this is coming from the top of the city, working our way down. And the next shot shows some, sort of where it's been chiseled out, I guess, and you can sort of see how smooth the floor is. And we actually split the 2 groups, didn't we, David? So there was a group that were prepared to go through water, to walk through the wet part, and then there was the wet group, which I was part of, which stayed on dry land.
Yes, I wasn't going to raise that, Eric, but if you go on a tour to Israel, you want to bring a pair of shoes that you're prepared to walk in the water with. And you do have to duck down, and we've all got phones these days and there's lights, but of course in ancient times it would have been very dark and quite scary. But yes, those tunnels dug out in the Old Testament times in 700 BC. Incredible.
And then the last shot here is the pools that you end up at. So this is where you exit. Shiloh pool, is it?
It is. It's at the end of the tunnel, and that's the pool of Siloam.
Pool, yeah.
And of course, there's a healing miracle there. A blind man receives his sight at that particular site. So that's a nice end to a kind of a bit of a spooky sort of a walk to end up at a significant place. Yeah. I think we've got another photo of the old city.
Yeah, that's right. So here's just some ruins. I don't actually remember this, David. I think it was right at the very start, wasn't it? Because we also had a bit of a show. I think there was a bit of a movie show, a 3D show.
Yes.
Photo of that as well. I think this was around the top of the tour.
Yeah, that's right. So there's a whole section of the old city, which is just all excavations, and then you begin with an interactive video type of a thing that you watch, and then you're kind of allowed to walk around. And these are houses that people would have lived in the Old Testament times. And so you can kind of see what their houses were like. On the whole, they're tiny, they're very small. Although there was also some wealthy people who had some slightly bigger houses. But yeah, you get a sense of what the old city was like. And there's some excavations and whatnot there.
Yeah, that was really good. And the next shot, so now we're moving into, I guess, a bit more of Jerusalem of today. So you can sort of see a bit of a shot back. So you see in the background, there's the dome, and a bit of an aerial shot. Just it shows you how tight it really is. I guess that's why I sort of grabbed this shot, because it just, with all the different quarters, it is actually pretty tight sort of little city, isn't it?
It's high density living. And so you can see a mosque there. So that's presumably in the Muslim quarter. There's a mosque off to your left, as well as a mosque in the far side. And then behind the mosque on the Temple Mound is the Mount of Olives. Yeah. And you can see the olive trees kind of over there. And in between the temple, the mosque, and the Mount of Olives will be the Kidron Valley. So yeah.
For those next week, yeah.
We will, yep.
And then the next shot here is just on the market stall. So as we go through the little alleyways and streets, you can there's lots of different people selling different wares in the different zones or quarters that you go through.
Yeah, and now we kind of get that Middle Eastern bazaar type feel. So it feels not unlike, say, being in Istanbul at the Grand Market or something like that. Yeah. Although you're paying Israel prices, not Turkish prices.
And sometimes you barter and sometimes you don't. It's all very confused. It depends what quarter you're in.
Yeah. So, but yeah, there's some pretty fascinating stuff. And again, you keep bumping into things. So you can walk down this, and then all of a sudden there's an excavation site, and you can see that the city of David was 5 meters lower than or 2 or 3 meters lower than where we currently are.
Yeah. It's amazing, isn't it? And the next one shows the Villa Dolorosa. So we did actually I Googled this photo to give a sense of what actually people are doing when they're marching with the cross. So this is supposed to be the route that Jesus was walked for his crucifixion. And then the next shot shows us there in real life, David.
Yeah, that's
the back of your head.
Yes, and your wife, Kath.
That's right.
Yeah. So, and there's one of the stations there of the Via Dolorosa just up ahead of us, written on the wall there. Yeah. So it's a Catholic thing to do in Holy Week, the Catholics would call it. And there are 9 stations of the cross on the walk. And then I think there's another 4 or 5 stations inside the church that we'll see next week. But you're visiting sites like where Jesus meets Pilate, where he has an interaction with John the Baptist about his mother. And a Catholic would tend to go and do this pilgrimage in Holy Week and just kind of stop at each of the stations of the cross. And if you went to a Catholic church today, you would find that a lot of their Easter practices still revolve around the stations of the cross. Yeah.
I guess the other thing that was interesting is like the different denominations. So different churches run by different denominations. So you talk about the Catholics, and there's the Orthodox, and then there's obviously different nationalities as well. So it actually is a bit of it's interesting how different religions, in a way, or different flavors of religion and how they celebrate it. And we're all mixed up in this city. It's just fascinating.
Yeah, you might think to yourself, the place is going to be full of Americans, and it is, but there's also like Filipino Christians. And they've got a different spirituality, right? And then after that, there's also like Orthodox Christians from Serbia. And they've got a Serbian tour guide who's kind of speaking to them in Serbian, and you're kind of going, Christianity is much more of a global phenomena than what we kind of appreciate. We just assume it's very Western, and to be a tourist and to be able to afford to go to Israel is also very Western. But of course, pilgrimages are very important, more so for the Orthodox and some of those traditional Catholic nations.
Well, I think it was highlighted a lot when you went to some of the locations and there were buses there, and you would see the different languages on the front of the bus. And you said the Chinese one, and whatever else there is. It's like, all the different nationalities as we line up for the buses. It was interesting. Parked outside the city, trying to get in. The next shot was I put this in here because one of the things that really surprised me actually was the security. So when you go through the different quarters, they'll have metal detectors and things like that. So there's a safety aspect and a security aspect, which was I guess I didn't really appreciate before we went there. It just shows that with the tourists and everyone going through, that there's still they're still pretty tight on security, I guess.
And you do feel remarkably safe. I remember some people saying, "Oh, isn't it dangerous going to Israel?" And and occasionally things happen, maybe up in the Golan Heights, so like another hour above Galilee. Maybe there's some disputed territory up there, but on the whole, in Israel, next to nothing happens, and it's very protected and very segregated and very controlled, and you feel quite safe.
Yeah, there was no aspect of fear or anything. It was just interesting how those quarters are really quarters, they're just like almost in countries,
Yeah.
it's fascinating,
Yeah.
The next shot, I thought I was going to hide, so I'm not sure why they're there. It's just a bit of a model, I guess, of the old city of David coming down the hill, really.
Yeah, so that's the old city of David in the foreground. So if we kept this slide, which we did, we probably should have put it earlier.
Yeah, I was going to hide it.
But you can actually see some of the more wealthier parts. And again, we'll pick up those next week, because what's up there in the background is probably where Caiaphas lives. And so where Jesus is put on trial. And that's Mount Moriah. And Mount Moriah is where Abraham begins to sacrifice Isaac. And so there's a connection between Abraham's sacrifice and the sacrifice of Jesus, because they're happening in more or less the same physical location.
Yeah, it actually, I didn't appreciate that before we did the trip, actually, that there were those connections, that you read the story about the sacrifice of Isaac, you don't actually realise that that's actually the same location or similar location where those things happen. So, yeah, it's just fascinating.
Yeah. Yeah. So a different sperm, but same city. Yeah. Yep.
And now we move on to the Temple Mount. So the next part is, same location, and I've just highlighted in red the Temple Mount. So this is basically this area here that you can sort of see, which is the, both the plateau that was built for the Temple of Solomon. So this was after David's son that built the temple.
Yeah, but of course, Herod the Great builds the Temple Mount that we experience today.
Yeah, and I think the next shot gives you a sense of, so this is this is the design for the temple that was done in Solomon's time. Is that right, David?
No, this is Herod's temple.
Right, okay.
And so I'll explain a couple of things here. So that's the temple there in the center. And it's bigger than the mosque, right? So the golden dome that you see, you kind of think, wow, that's massive and it dwarfs the city. And we'll get some perspective of that next week when we look across from the Mount of Olives. But this is like more than 2 times bigger and higher, right? So it's an impressive building. To the left, you've got the porch there. That's probably where the trading is happening, where Jesus turns over the tables. And then to the right, you've got a garrison. So there would have been soldiers who lived there permanently because, of course, the temple is potentially a hotspot. And so it's an incredibly impressive building. And you can see from this perspective that ground level is not natural. Right, I think it's about 30 odd acres of sandstone that's just up to meters in the air, and then there's a temple built on top of it. And there would have been at Passover hundreds of people walking there. So yeah, it's an unbelievable architectural engineering achievement. It just dwarfs the rest of the city in terms of its kind of impact. And it would have been not quite one of the 7 wonders of the world, but not far off. It would have been very impressive as a first century building.
Now, I seem to recall that this fence here or that wall there was the old city, and then you can sort of see where it's extended out.
Yes. Yeah.
And also, I think when we were on the Temple Mount, this gate here, I think we did see a gate, didn't we, that you would step down through?
Yes.
So I think that gate was there still as well.
Yeah, we'll deal with the gates next week.
Yeah.
But of course, there's the gate that Jesus comes into in the Passion Week. And then there's the gate that is alluded to in the book of Revelations, but we'll deal with that next week.
So these shots just give you a sense of the wall. So this is the Western Wall. So this is in the Jewish quarter. And this little catwalk here we actually have to use that to access the Muslim quarter, which is on the other side of this wall here. And you can see the Dome of the Rock over here as well. And that's part of that Temple Mount that we're talking about.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's probably the most important site for any Jew, the Western Wall, because it's believed to be where the first temple was. And it's the only remnants of the second temple after the temple was destroyed by the Romans in 70 AD.
And then there's a few, so I've got a few shots here. So again, this just gives you a sense of the plateau that we're talking about. So the man-made, I guess, the wall, and then the Western Wall is actually around the other side of that. And then here across the top is the Dome of the Rock. You can sort of see the mosque, and you can sort of see that sandstone base that we're talking about.
Yeah, and again, I'm going from memory here, but I think the Ottoman Empire builds that. So I think it's perhaps in the 1700s, something like that, that mosque is built. It's the third most holy building in Islam. And I think Muhammad is believed to have been kind of ascended to heaven, I think, from Jerusalem.
That's right, you're right, yeah. So that's right. So that's why it's sacred to them, because from their point of view, that's the last place Muhammad was before he ascended to heaven. So that's right.
Yeah.
And then on the Jewish side, they face the wall, and that's where they pray in the wall on a regular basis as well. So that's sacred to them.
Yeah.
And then this just gives you some shots of because it's a beautiful site. Like, I mean, you can sort of see on the outside of the building, it's just a beautiful mosaics. And then here you can sort of see the mosaics and the archways as well. So yeah, it's very, very scenic and pretty.
Again, I think some of those mosaics come from Nicaea.
Right, okay.
Where we get the Nicene Creed.
Yeah.
So there you go.
Is it Nicaea as well on your trip?
Or Iznik, yes. Yes, we've been to Iznik as well. Yeah, yeah. Okay.
Okay, and there's one more, just gives you a sense looking back. Anyway, and now we move into the Western Wall. So this is what we're talking about, the site. So you can sort of see the Western Wall is on the bottom part of that Temple Mount that we're talking about.
Yeah, so the mosque that we just saw, the Al-Aqsa Mosque, that was the one you just showed us a photo of, looking back from the Temple Mount. Yeah. And then just to the side of that is where the Western Wall is.
That's right. That's this bit here, yeah. And we basically accessed it through here. That's where the walkway was.
Yeah.
And then you can also see this dotted line here, which we'll see a bit of the tunnel later as well, but you can sort of see how far that tunnel goes down the side of the wall.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And then what we actually did was, so the first night we got to Jerusalem, we did a night tour, like it was an ad hoc thing. I think people were just keen. So we actually went there in the evening. It was really, really beautiful because it was all lit up, as you can see. And you can sort of see along the wall, you can sort of see the people there praying along the wall as well.
Yeah. So staying in Jerusalem is different from staying in Galilee, because like when you're in Galilee, when you get back to your motel, that's it for the night, right? And you go to the swimming pool. Whereas in Jerusalem, if you want, you can just walk into the city yourself. It's not that far. And so some of the tour just decided to stroll into the city together, and this is what they saw. I don't remember what evening was, if it was a Tuesday evening or a Thursday evening. I think that's when they practice bar mitzvahs. So Jews from all over the world turning 13 would come there and have their first bar mitzvah. And of course, if it was a Friday evening, then that's the beginning of the Sabbath, and the place would be absolutely packed. So you guys went there on one of those evenings. I don't remember which one it was.
Yeah, I can't recall as well, but I know it was very, very busy. As you can see in the photos, there's a lot of people there. You can sort of see here, you can sort of see there's a wall area here, I guess, that you can go in, but when you go in, you need to wear one of those little hats
Yeah.
little cap. So yeah, because it's I suppose it's a sacred site as far as the Jews are concerned. So there's a bit of a dress code that you need to wear, and then you sort of see the tourists who are on the outside here as well.
Yeah.
You see this guy here who was blowing a horn, which was nice in that, I suppose, because the horn's got biblical references as well, hasn't it, David? But yeah, just to hear the sound of it, it was really fabulous. Yeah.
Yep.
The other part was here's a bit of a close-up. I mean, it's a bit of a video, so I'll just play it. But the thing that was interesting was you can sort of see people praying as they're doing it, they do the nodding as they're praying, which I thought was, just quite different to the way we would approach prayer. But you can sort of see there's and the other part, which is interesting, you can sort of see obviously it's all men here, and there's a screen here, and the women were on the other side of the screen. So it was men to women.
And that's something else you encounter in Israel, and you actually get pockets of it in Melbourne. If you go to Caulfield in Melbourne, you will experience this. I've driven through Caulfield on a Friday night, and you see men dressed like this in Australia. You wouldn't believe it, but it's not so much our experience here in Sydney. But you've got different types of Jews. So you've got the very Orthodox Jews there, and then you've got closer to us, the guy wearing the jean shorts. Obviously, he's a kind of a more liberal or a progressive sort of a Jew.
Yeah.
But the Orthodox Jews, they will just stand against that wall and chant for hours and hours, and they'll write their prayers on little bits of paper and kind of jam them into the wall. And for those New Peninsula people who happen to be watching, that's David, as in husband of Ruth. And we can see him with his back, also just watching with interest.
Yeah, no, it was fabulous. It really was great. Let's forget that. That was that. And then this was the next day, I think. So it's a bit of a day light shot. You can sort of see the chairs set up and you can still see people there. So it goes pretty well 24/7, doesn't it, David? Like all day, all night, there's people there.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's a real magnet for activity, and there's just people coming and going, tourists and religious people praying. Now, just look at that wall, right? And just think, like I said earlier, the wall is meters high. You can see how tall that is. And that was built by Herod the Great before Jesus. Like, that's unbelievable. It's a dry, packed wall, so all those stones are chiseled so that they fit just right on top of each other. And some of those stones, when you're walking next to them, they are humongous. Like, those are the smaller ones, but there's some far bigger ones in other places.
And no cement, I think. So they basically just join together, don't they?
Correct. Yeah, they're dry stacked. Yeah. It's unbelievable. Yeah.
The last shot is, I guess they, when you go into that area, they actually give you a book, so you can have a prayer book or whatever in different languages as well. So you sort of see them all on here as well. And I guess you sort of see the different people with their religious or rabbis or whatever that will be reading the word while they're there as well. So I just thought it was really fascinating as well.
Yeah. Yep.
Okay, and next part is we go into the tunnel. So right next to the wall, there was an entranceway, and we did what we call the rabbinic tunnel tour. And I think right at the very start of the tunnel, there was this a synagogue. I guess you can see the minaret around the corner here. So there was a synagogue in part of adjacent to the wall. I think this part was, wasn't it, David?
Correct. Yeah. And I think what's above that, of course, is part of the platform that people are walking on. So yeah, it's amazing. And this is inside the wall. So you've got tunnels and stuff in a minute, but it's kind of, again, you're just taken by surprise that something so beautiful and so architecturally sensitive is inside a wall.
Yeah, and I think as you go down the wall, so you sort of see now we're starting to walk, and you sort of see different heights.
Yeah.
So you sort of see that's you're more stooping to get through here, and then you look at the height here, and that's like 20 meters high, sort of thing. So it's just a massive difference.
And you can see there how big some of those rocks are.
Yeah, and we actually did get to touch the rocks as well, because we're sort of touching these stones like at this level here. they've been there for, thousands of years, haven't they, really? That
Yeah, a couple of thousand years, yeah.
Yeah, as part of the original tunnel. And as we go into this part here, you can sort of see there was a bit of a sneak shot. So the women were actually there's an alcove in there, and they were praying. So this is the women's prayer area as well, which is against the wall. And when I was reading up on it, they're saying at different parts along the wall, for example, they've worked out that where the Holy of Holies would have been. So they're trying to get as close to the Holy of Holies that they can underneath the wall.
Yeah, yeah, and to hand it to the Jews, they're very devout. So they will just read scripture or pray or chant, and they'll do that for hours.
Yeah. And then the next one was inside the tunnel as well. So this is the last photo. You can sort of see on this catwalk there's all water here, and so they had cisterns. So when you think about the temple now, they actually have drainage on top of that big flat area, and then they would funnel the water in. You can sort of see there's some spouts over here, and then the water would funnel in. They were doing water storage as well. So it's not just a beautiful site, but they're actually, using the landscape, I guess, of the flat area to store water in these cisterns.
Yeah, and the scale of it is quite massive, obviously. Yeah. So Herod the Great is an amazing builder. Yeah. So is that
That's it.
That's it. So
That's it.
Join us next week as we round out our tour of Israel and our tour of Jerusalem. So we've picked up parts of the city this week. Next week, we will focus on the Garden of Gethsemane, the Mount of Olives, the Passion Week, the churches that celebrate where Jesus died. There's one or two rival sites which both claim to be the tomb. So we'll have a look at those. So join us next week. But we've got a taste for what's an amazing city, and potentially when you've got the most holy city for Jerusalem, for Jews, where you've got Christians there, where you've got Muslims there, you're just profoundly conscious that spirituality and religion has shaped the world and this city in very profound ways. And it feels quite different to secular Australia. It's a very spiritual experience being in Jerusalem. Hope you enjoy this week. Look forward to catching you for our final tour next week. Good night.
Right, bye.